At 4 in the morning, on March 28, 1979, a man named Craig Faust was staring at an indicator light that was lying to him. He did not know it was lying. Nobody in the room knew. The light said a valve was closed. The valve was open. And over the next 2 hours, because of that single lie, half the uranium core of a nuclear reactor would melt. But here is the part nobody tells you about 3 Mile Island. Faust was not incompetent. Neither was Ed Frederick, who was standing next to him, or Bill Zewi, who was supervising the shift, or Fred Scheiman, who was running the board. All 4 men were former United States Navy reactor operators. All 4 held active NRC licenses. All 4 scored well above average on their certification exams. These were not amateurs fumbling through an emergency. They were trained professionals making the best decisions they could with the information their instruments were giving them. And every decision they made was rational. Every single one. That is the part that should disturb you. Because the official investigation, the one ordered by the President of the United States, did not conclude that the operators failed. It concluded that the system had been designed in a way that guaranteed they would fail. The instruments lied. The training was wrong. The procedures were inadequate. The control room was, in the Commission's own words, greatly inadequate for managing an accident. The operators were not the cause of the disaster. They were the last people to find out it was happening. 5 years later, a sociologist at Yale named Charles Perrow published a book that would explain exactly why. And buried in that book was a proof, not a mathematical formula on a chalkboard, something worse, a logical demonstration that in certain types of systems, the ones you depend on for electricity and finance and air travel and everything else that keeps your life running, catastrophic failure is not a risk to be managed. It is a property of the architecture. It is built in. It is, in Perrow's word, normal. That book was published in 1984. It predicted Chernobyl within 2 years. It predicted the 2008 financial crisis 2 decades early. And the single most unsettling thing about it is that the mechanisms it describes have not been fixed. They cannot be fixed, and they are running underneath every critical system you interact with right now, including the ones that are supposed to tell you when something is going wrong. You were never told this, and there is a very specific reason why. Let me take you inside that control room. Not because the story of 3 Mile Island is interesting. You have probably heard it before. I want to take you inside because what happened in that room in 1979 is happening right now, everywhere, in systems you cannot see. And the reason you cannot see it is the same reason Craig Faust could not see a stuck valve. The architecture of the system is hiding it from you. At 4 a.m. and 36 seconds, a set of condensate polisher valves closed because a small amount of water, maybe a cupful, had gotten into an instrument air line 11 hours earlier. Nobody could have predicted this. The water tripped the condensate pumps. The condensate pumps tripping killed the main feed water pumps. The feed water pumps dying meant the steam generators lost their water supply. The turbine tripped. A violent water hammer shook the building. All of this happened in under 4 seconds. 3 seconds later, with no way to remove heat, the coolant temperature started climbing fast. The coolant expanded into the pressurizer. Pressure hit 2,255 pounds per square inch. A relief valve called the pork, opened to vent steam. This was by design. The valve was doing what it was supposed to do. 5 seconds after that, pressure reached the high trip set point at 2355 psi, and the reactor scrammed automatically. Control rods dropped. The chain reaction stopped, but decay heat was still pouring out of the fuel at roughly 60 megawatts. You cannot turn that off. It is a consequence of physics, not engineering. The uranium will produce heat whether you want it to or not. And that heat needs somewhere to go. Now here is where the system started lying. 3 emergency feed water pumps kicked on automatically, exactly as designed. But 2 days earlier, someone had left the block valves in both emergency feed water lines closed after a surveillance test. This violated NRC rules. One of the valve position indicators on the control panel was hidden behind a yellow maintenance tag. So the emergency pumps ran for 8 minutes, pumping against closed valves, pushing water nowhere, while the steam generators boiled dry. Meanwhile, that poor valve, it opened at 2255 psi. Pressure dropped. At 2205 psi, the control system sent a signal telling the valve to close. The indicator light on the control panel went dark, which meant, according to the system's logic, that the valve had closed. But the indicator was not measuring the valve. It was measuring the electrical signal sent to the valve. The signal went out. The light changed. The valve did not move. It was mechanically stuck open, and roughly 1,000 gallons per minute of primary coolant was now streaming out of the reactor. There was a temperature gauge downstream of the valve that read 285 degrees Fahrenheit, which would have told the operators the valve was leaking. But it was mounted on the back of a 7-foot-tall instrument panel, out of direct line of sight, and nobody had ever been trained to use it for diagnostic purposes. So the operators were now managing an emergency with a feed water system they did not know was blocked, and a relief valve they did not know was open, and their instruments were telling them everything was fine. That is not human error. That is architectural betrayal. But the worst part had not happened yet. 2 minutes in, pressure dropped far enough to trigger the engineered safeguard system. High-pressure injection pumps started automatically, pushing borated water into the reactor. This was the system doing exactly what it was designed to do in a loss of coolant accident. And in a loss of coolant accident, it would have worked. But here is the thing the operators did not know. With the pore stuck open, steam was escaping from the top of the pressurizer. That meant pressure was dropping. At the same time, water from the primary loop was surging up through the surge line into the pressurizer from below. A steam bubble was forming in the reactor vessel head, invisible to everyone because no instrument existed to measure water level inside the reactor vessel. The pressurizer level was rising. The total amount of water in the system was falling, and the only instrument the operators had been trained to trust was the pressurizer level indicator, which was telling them they had too much water. Ed Frederick looked at that rising level and did what his training demanded. He reduced high-pressure injection. He shut down a makeup pump. He maximized letdown to remove water from the system. His logic was airtight. Every Navy reactor operator in America would have done the same thing. The pressurizer was approaching solid water conditions, and their training was explicit. You never let the pressurizer go solid. A solid pressurizer means you lose the steam bubble that acts as a pressure cushion, and a pressure transient could rupture a pipe. So Frederick did the right thing. He followed his procedures. He trusted his instruments, and he cut off the flow of water that was the only thing keeping the reactor core from melting. A Davis-Besse operator who experienced an almost identical precursor event 18 months earlier later wrote a letter that laid the real cause bare. The mental model they were trained on, he said, told them the universe revolved around the Earth. Multiple operators at different plants did not independently conceive the same wrong picture of what was happening. That picture was inserted into their heads during training. By 6:22 a.m., someone finally closed a block valve upstream of the stuck PORV. 2 hours and 22 minutes of coolant loss, roughly 32,000 gallons gone, 1/3 of the reactor's capacity. The core had been uncovered. Temperatures in the fuel had exceeded 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit in hotspots. Zirconium cladding had reacted with steam, producing hydrogen. Containment radiation levels hit 800 rem per hour. Approximately half the uranium fuel had melted. At 1:50 in the afternoon, nearly 10 hours after the initial failure, a hydrogen explosion inside the containment building produced a 28 pound per square inch pressure spike. The operators heard a thud and dismissed it as a ventilation door. They did not know that zirconium cladding, reacting with steam, had been producing hydrogen gas for hours. They did not know they were sitting next to a building full of explosive gas. It took days to understand the hydrogen bubble and determine that it was not going to detonate with enough force to breach containment. During those days, Governor Thornburg advised pregnant women and preschool children within a 5-mile radius to evacuate. Within 72 hours, roughly 140,000 people fled the area around the plant. President Carter, who had trained as a nuclear engineer in the Navy and had once personally helped disassemble a damaged reactor in Canada, visited on April 1st and walked through the control room. There is a detail about the timing that is almost too perfect to be real. 12 days before the accident, Columbia Pictures released a film called The China Syndrome, starring Jane Fonda, about a near meltdown at a nuclear plant, caused by a stuck open valve and instrument failures that misled operators. The nuclear industry had called the movie sheer fiction and character assassination of an entire industry. 12 days later, the fiction became fact. The stuck valve, the misleading instruments, the operators doing everything right while the system did everything wrong. A screenwriter could not have written a more precise prophecy. And here is where Perrow's insight becomes something you cannot look away from. The official Kemeny Commission report, the one the President of the United States ordered, found that the primary cause of the accident was not operator error. It was not equipment failure. It was not even the stuck valve, which had failed 11 times before at other plants. The primary cause was a mindset. The Commission called it a prevailing attitude, held by the utility and the regulators alike, that serious accidents were practically impossible. That mindset meant nobody questioned whether the instruments could lie. Nobody checked whether the emergency valves were open. Nobody asked what would happen if 4 things went wrong simultaneously in the first 13 seconds. And that mindset did not come from carelessness. It came from the system itself. That is what Perrow saw, and that is what makes his work different from every other accident investigation ever published. Charles Perrow was not a physicist. He was not an engineer. He was a sociologist, born in Tacoma, Washington in 1925, a World War II veteran who served with the 10th Mountain Division ski troopers before studying at Berkeley under Philip Selznick. He had spent most of his career studying something that sounds almost unbearably boring: organizational theory, how companies structure themselves, how bureaucracies process information. He published a well-regarded textbook called Complex Organizations. He spent years categorizing technology along dimensions of variability and analyzability. He was, by every measure, an unlikely candidate to write the most important book about catastrophic system failure in the 20th century. But Perrow had something the nuclear engineers did not. He understood organizations as systems, not just machines with operators attached, but interlocking webs of procedures and incentives and information flows and power structures that behave in ways no single component can predict. And when he was brought in to analyze 3 Mile Island, he saw something that the Kemeny Commission had gestured toward, but not fully grasped. The accident was not a failure of the system. The accident was the system working exactly as its architecture demanded. He published his findings in 1984. The book was called Normal Accidents, and the title was not metaphorical. Perrow meant it literally. In systems with 2 specific properties, catastrophic accidents are not anomalies. They are the statistically inevitable product of how the system is built. They are normal, not normal in the sense of being frequent, normal in the sense of being inherent. As Perrow put it with characteristic dark precision, it is normal for us to die, but we only do it once. The 2 properties are interactive complexity and tight coupling. And understanding them is the difference between thinking you can prevent the next disaster and knowing that you cannot. Interactive complexity means the components of a system interact in ways that are unexpected, invisible, and nonlinear. In a linearly complex system, cause and effect follow visible paths. You can trace what happened and why. In an interactively complex system, 2 or more failures can combine in sequences that were never anticipated, never planned for, and cannot be comprehended in real time by operators who are trained on 1 failure at a time. The interactions are hidden. They happen inside pipes you cannot see, between subsystems that were never supposed to talk to each other, through feedback loops that exist in the physics but not in any manual. Tight coupling means there is no slack. Processes happen fast and cannot be stopped. Sequences are invariant, meaning there is only one path from A to B, and if something blocks that path, you cannot improvise an alternative. Failed components cannot be isolated because everything is connected to everything else. And what happens in one part of the system has immediate and significant effects on every other part. Think about what happened at TMI. The condensate polisher failure triggered the feed water pump failure, triggered the turbine trip, triggered the pressure spike, triggered the PORV opening. That chain took 4 seconds. 4 failures in 4 seconds. And each failure changed the meaning of the instrument readings for every subsequent failure. The pressurizer level was rising because of the PORV leak, but the operators read it as rising because of the injection pumps. The temperature gauge behind the panel was reading high because the valve was open, but nobody was looking at it because the indicator light said the valve was closed. Every piece of information the operators received was technically accurate in isolation and profoundly misleading in combination. That is interactive complexity. The components were interacting in ways nobody designed, nobody anticipated, and nobody could untangle in real time. And the system was tightly coupled because there was no buffer. The operators had seconds to respond to cascading failures that were propagating faster than human comprehension. There was no way to pause the reactor, step back, think for 20 minutes, and figure out what was happening. The physics would not wait. Perrow's devastating insight was that these two properties create a paradox that cannot be resolved. Interactive complexity demands decentralized decision-making. The people closest to the problem need the authority to act, because nobody at headquarters can understand the unique combination of failures unfolding on the ground. But tight coupling demands centralized control. When every part of the system affects every other part immediately, you need coordinated response, not individual operators making independent choices that might contradict each other. You cannot have both, and systems that need both, which is to say every nuclear plant, every chemical facility, every densely interconnected financial market, every tightly integrated power grid, are structurally incapable of managing the emergencies they will inevitably produce. This is not a management problem. It is not a training problem. You cannot fix it by hiring better people or writing better procedures or adding more safety systems. In fact, and Perrow documented this extensively, adding safety systems can make the problem worse. Every new backup adds complexity. Every new interlock creates new interaction pathways. Every new alarm gives operators another signal to misinterpret. Redundancy designed to prevent failure became the mechanism through which failure propagated. The systems designed to protect the operators became the systems that blinded them. Normal Accidents was published in 1984. 2 years later, Chernobyl happened. The same year the book came out, Bhopal happened. In his introduction, Perrow had written that unless we are very lucky, one or more serious nuclear accidents will appear within the next decade. He needed to wait 24 months, but that was only the first layer of what makes you blind, because Perrow's theory explains why complex systems fail. It explains why operators cannot see failure coming, why safety systems become vectors of harm, why every investigation blames the human when the architecture was the cause. What it does not explain is something even more disturbing, something operating at a completely different level. There is a second layer of blindness. It affects not just operators in control rooms, but every person and institution that tries to anticipate catastrophic risk. This blindness is not organizational. It is mathematical. It is embedded in the equations that every bank, every insurance company, every regulator, every grid operator, and every government uses to decide what is safe and what is dangerous. And it was proven wrong with the full rigor of probability theory decades before anyone bothered to listen. To understand it, you need to understand one thing about the bell curve. The thing you were taught in every statistics class you ever took. The thing that underpins virtually every risk model in the world. The thing that is wrong. The Gaussian distribution makes a very specific promise about the world. It promises that extreme events are vanishingly rare, not just unlikely, so rare that they might as well be impossible. The math is explicit. In a Gaussian distribution, the tails decay exponentially. The probability of an event drops off precipitously as you move away from the average, not gradually, not gently, but like falling off a cliff into nothing. Under a Gaussian model, a 5 sigma event, a 5 standard deviation move, should happen roughly once every 14,000 years of daily observations. A 10 sigma event should take longer than the age of the universe. A 25 sigma event has a probability so small it requires a number with over 130 zeros after the decimal point. This is not a rough estimate. This is what the equations say with full mathematical certainty. And if the equations were correct, we would live in a world where stock markets never crash, nuclear plants never melt down, 100-year floods happen once a century, and financial crises are essentially impossible. You already know the equations are not correct, but knowing they are wrong and understanding what they are hiding from you are very different things. In 1963, a mathematician named Benoit Mandelbrot published a paper that should have ended the use of Gaussian models in finance before the industry even got started. The paper was called The Variation of Certain Speculative Prices. It appeared in the Journal of Business, and what Mandelbrot found, using cotton price data going back to 1900, was that financial returns do not follow a bell curve. They follow a power law distribution. The tails do not decay exponentially. They decay polynomially. And the difference between those two words, exponential and polynomial, is the difference between a world where catastrophe is impossible and a world where catastrophe is routine. Here is what that means in numbers you can feel. Under a Gaussian model, a 5 sigma market move should happen once every 14,000 years, under a power law with an exponent of about 3, which matches what the data actually shows. A 5 sigma move has a probability of roughly 1 in 125. That is not rare. That is roughly once every 6 months. The power law says a 5 sigma event is approximately 28,000 times more likely than the Gaussian model predicts. For a 10 sigma event, the gap does not widen. It detonates. The Gaussian says once in 10 to the 20th power years. The power law says something that happens within a human lifetime. The discrepancy is 20 orders of magnitude. That is not an error in the 4th decimal place. That is the difference between predicting something will never happen in the history of the universe and predicting it will happen before you retire. Mandelbrot said this in 1963. He said it clearly, with data, in a major journal. Paul Samuelson called the work historic and compared Mandelbrot to John von Neumann. Eugene Fama, who would later win a Nobel Prize, wrote his doctoral thesis partly exploring Mandelbrot's hypothesis and found empirical evidence confirming fat tails. There were 10 times as many extreme observations as the Gaussian model predicted. Fama published this in 1965. And then the entire field looked away. The reason was not complicated. Gaussian distributions are mathematically convenient. They allow you to calculate correlations, run regressions, build pricing formulas, and teach elegant courses with neat closed-form solutions. Power law distributions do not. They imply infinite variance, which means standard statistical techniques become meaningless. Building on power laws would require rebuilding the entire mathematical infrastructure of quantitative finance from scratch. So the profession chose elegance over accuracy. They chose the math they could do over the math that was right. And for 40 years, every risk model, every options pricing formula, Every value at risk calculation, every stress test, every regulatory capital requirement was built on the assumption that extreme events are essentially impossible. This was not a quiet academic disagreement. This was the mathematical scaffolding of the global economy, and it was built on a foundation that had been proven wrong before the first beam was raised. Mandelbrot would spend the next 4 decades trying to get the profession to listen. In 2004, he published A Misbehavior of Markets, in which he wrote that conventional financial models are not merely wrong, they are dangerously wrong. They are like a shipbuilder who assumes that gales are rare and hurricanes myth. So he builds his vessel for speed, capacity, and comfort, giving little thought to stability and strength. The 20th century produced 48 days on which the Dow swung more than 7%. Standard bell curve models predict such swings should occur once every 300,000 years. The real world produced them 48 times in 100 years. That is not a small miscalibration. That is a model that is off by a factor of more than 100,000. In August of 2007, Goldman Sachs chief financial officer David Vinaar told the Financial Times that they were seeing things that were 25 standard deviation moves several days in a row. Think about what he was saying. He was using the language of the Gaussian model to describe events the Gaussian model says cannot occur. It was like a navigator announcing he had arrived at a location that does not exist. On his map, the correct response is not to question your position. It is to throw away the map. Goldman did not throw away its map. Mandelbrot died in October of 2010 at 85, having been right for 47 years. Charlie Munger later channeled his legacy with characteristic bluntness. When people talk about sigmas in terms of disaster probabilities in markets, they are crazy. They think probabilities in markets are Gaussian distributions because it is easy to compute and teach. But if you think Gaussian distributions apply to markets, then you must believe in the tooth fairy. And yet, a wrong foundation only becomes a catastrophe when someone builds something enormous on top of it. And in the year 2000, a quiet, brilliant Chinese-Canadian statistician named David Lee gave Wall Street the tool to build something so enormous that when it collapsed, it would vaporize roughly $50 trillion of global wealth in a single year. Li was born Li Xianglin in Nanjing, China, sometime in the 1960s. His family was sent to a rural village during the Cultural Revolution for re-education. He left China in 1987, accumulated degrees from Laval University in Quebec and the University of Waterloo, where he earned a PhD in statistics in 1995. He worked at several Canadian financial institutions before arriving on Wall Street. He was, by all accounts, reserved, brilliant, and deeply focused on the mathematics of survival analysis, the statistical study of time until events occur. He had studied actuarial science and was fascinated by a concept from that field called the broken heart effect, the observed phenomenon that when one spouse dies, the surviving spouse's probability of dying spikes dramatically. The two deaths are correlated in a way that the raw individual mortality tables do not capture. In 2000, Lee published a paper in the Journal of Fixed Income called On Default Correlation, a Copula function approach. The idea was elegant and seemingly miraculous. The central problem in structured finance was this: if you bundle 1,000 mortgages into a security, you need to know the probability that they default together. If defaults are independent, the risk is small. If they are correlated, if one default makes another more likely, the risk concentrates in ways that can destroy supposedly safe tranches. But measuring default correlation directly requires decades of data that did not exist for the new exotic instruments being created. Lee's breakthrough was to use credit default swap prices as a proxy. CDS prices reflect the market's real-time assessment of default risk. By mapping those prices through a Gaussian Copula function, Lee could estimate default correlations without historical data. The entire complexity of correlated default across a pool of thousands of borrowers collapsed into a single number, one parameter, gamma, the correlation coefficient. The formula was computationally simple. Standard & Poor's CDO evaluator could run 100,000 Monte Carlo simulations in about 2.5 minutes. It made previously unpriceable instruments appear safely priced. And within a year of publication, it was adopted by essentially every major financial institution on Earth. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Deutsche Bank, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, the rating agencies, Moody's and Standard & Poor's and Fitch used it to assign AAA ratings to instruments that would later be worth pennies. Structured finance represented at least 40% of their revenues. The credit default swap market, which stood at $920 billion at the end of 2001, grew to more than $62 trillion by the end of 2007. That is not a typo. 62 trillion, 100-fold increase in 6 years. CDO issuance peaked at $445 billion in 2006. Total over-the-counter derivative notional value reached $683 trillion by mid-2008. And all of it was priced by a single formula that assumed default correlations follow a Gaussian distribution. Think about what that means. Think about what Mandelbrot proved 40 years earlier. Gaussian tails underestimate extreme events by factors of thousands to millions. Lee's Copula used Gaussian tails to model the probability of correlated defaults, which means the probability of everything going wrong at once, the probability of a systemic cascade where every mortgage in a pool defaults simultaneously was being systematically treated as essentially zero. Lee himself understood. In 2005, 3 years before the collapse, he told the Wall Street Journal that very few people understand the essence of the model. He acknowledged in writing that the framework had little theoretical justification from financial economics. And he said something that sounds, in retrospect, like a man watching a building being constructed on quicksand and being powerless to stop it. The most dangerous part, he said, is when people believe everything coming out of it. Now I want you to see the parallel, because what happened on Wall Street between 2000 and 2008 is structurally identical to what happened at 3 Mile Island. The operators, in this case traders and risk managers and rating agency analysts, were staring at instruments that were lying to them. The Gaussian Copula said the probability of correlated default was negligible. That was the indicator light that said the valve was closed. The rating agencies said the senior tranches were AAA, as safe as US Treasury bonds. That was the pressurizer level saying the system had too much water. The model said the worst-case loss was manageable. That was the training manual saying you never let the pressurizer go solid. And just like TMI, Every operator acted rationally, given what the instruments showed. That is the horror of it. Nobody was crazy. Nobody was reckless in the way you might imagine. They were following the math. And the math was wrong. AIG Financial Products is the clearest case study. They sold credit default swap protection on super senior CDO tranches, the tranches that the Gaussian Copula said would essentially never default. Their exposure grew from $2 billion in 2003 to $54 billion in 2005, with total CDS exposure reaching approximately $441 billion. One of their executives, Gene Park, discovered that the CDOs they were insuring were roughly 80% subprime mortgages rather than the 10% they had been told. He warned that it was horrendous business, that they should get out of it. He was overruled. When housing prices began declining nationally for the first time, something the models had never contemplated, because they were calibrated on less than a decade of data during which prices only rose. Default correlations did not stay at the modeled values of 0.2 to 0.3. They went to 1. Everything defaulted together. The formula that said simultaneous default was impossible was confronted with simultaneous default happening everywhere at once. Over 90% of AAA-rated mortgage-backed securities from 2006 and 2007 were downgraded to junk. AIG's collateral calls hit $23 billion, with only $9 billion in cash. The government bailout totaled $182 billion. AIG posted the largest quarterly loss in corporate history, nearly $62 billion in a single quarter. And here is where Perrow's theory merges with Mandelbrot's mathematics into something that should keep you awake, because the financial system was tightly coupled and interactively complex in exactly the way Perrow described nuclear plants. Every institution was connected to every other institution through webs of derivatives that nobody fully mapped. The failure of one counterparty triggered margin calls on others, which forced asset sales, which depressed prices, which triggered more margin calls. There was no slack. There was no buffer. There was no way to pause the system and think. The cascade propagated at the speed of electronic trading, faster than regulators could understand, faster than CEOs could respond, faster than anyone could see it coming. And just like TMI, the safety systems made it worse. The very instruments that were supposed to prevent catastrophe, the Gaussian risk models, the AAA ratings, the value at risk calculations, had created the conditions for it. They gave everyone confidence that the system was safe. That confidence allowed leverage to grow to obscene levels. And when the system broke, the models provided no warning at all, because they had been mathematically designed to ignore exactly the type of event that was occurring. But the darkest part of this story is not that the models were wrong. It is that people who said the models were wrong were systematically destroyed. Brooksley Bourne graduated first in her class from Stanford Law School in 1964. One of only 7 women, the first woman to serve as president of the Stanford Law Review. She headed the derivatives practice at one of Washington's most prestigious law firms before being appointed chair of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission in 1996. She was, by any measure, one of the most accomplished financial lawyers in America. Shortly after her appointment, Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan invited her to lunch at his private dining room in the Fed building. Bourne later recounted the conversation. Greenspan told her that he guessed they would never agree about fraud. Bourne asked what there was to disagree about. Greenspan said he did not think there was any need for a law against fraud. The market would take care of itself. In May of 1998, Bourne issued what is called a concept release, not a regulation, not even a proposed rule, simply an invitation for public comment on whether the over-the-counter derivatives market, which had grown from $3 trillion to over $27 trillion, might need some form of oversight. The response was ferocious and immediate. Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin and his deputy Larry Summers mobilized against her. Greenspan joined them. SEC Chairman Arthur Levitt sided with them. Bourne's Chief of Staff, Michael Greenberger, walked into her office one day and found the blood drained from her face. She had just hung up the phone with Summers. He had told her she was going to cause the worst financial crisis since the end of World War II. He said he had 13 bankers in his office who had informed him of this. Think about that. The person trying to regulate the derivatives market was told that regulation itself would cause a crisis by the people whose deregulated market would, 10 years later, cause the actual worst financial crisis since the Depression. Greenspan, Rubin, and Levitt issued a joint statement of grave concern within hours of Bourne's concept release. Congress froze the CFTC's authority for 6 months. Bourne resigned in 1990. The Commodity Futures Modernization Act of 2000 formally prohibited federal regulation of OTC derivatives. The door was not just left open, it was welded in place. 3 years later, at the Federal Reserve's annual conference at Jackson Hole in August 2005, an Indian economist named Raghuram Rajan presented a paper titled "Has Financial Development Made the World Riskier?" The conference was Alan Greenspan's victory lap. He was retiring. The paper's was celebratory. Rajan's was not supposed to be controversial. His own IMF staff's data had been expected to confirm that financial innovation had made the system safer. Instead, the data showed the opposite. Rajan warned that financial innovation could create a greater, albeit still small, probability of a catastrophic meltdown. He said compensation structures rewarded bankers for taking risks with other people's money while imposing no penalties for losses. Larry Summers stood up and called the paper slightly Luddite and largely misguided. The Fed vice chairman dismissed the concerns. Rajan later wrote that he felt like an early Christian who had wandered into a convention of half-starved lions. Every word of his paper was validated within 3 years, but by then the damage was done. This is not just a story about bad models and ignored warnings. This is a story about a system that actively resists correction. Because the blindness is not passive. The system does not merely fail to see risk, it punishes the people who point it out. Bourne was destroyed. Rajan was mocked. Mandelbrot was sidelined for 4 decades. And the reason is not conspiracy. The reason is structural. It is the same organizational logic Perrow identified. In a tightly coupled system, the people who benefit from the current architecture have enormous power to suppress information that threatens it. The coupling is not just mechanical. It is social and political and financial. The banks fund the regulators. The regulators hire from the banks. The academics build models the banks need. The rating agencies are paid by the institutions they rate. Every incentive points in the direction of continued blindness. Every feedback loop reinforces the assumption that the system is safe. And here is where it gets worse. Because everything I've described so far Perrow's organizational blindness, Mandelbrot's mathematical blindness, the destruction of whistleblowers, all of that operates at the level of institutions, at the level of systems and organizations and industries. There is still another layer, the deepest one, and it operates inside your own head. Nassim Taleb was born in Amiens, Lebanon in 1960 into a Greek Orthodox family of Antiochian descent. His grandfather and great-grandfather had both been deputy prime ministers. His father was an oncologist. The family was prominent, educated, wealthy. And in 1975, when Taleb was 15, the Lebanese civil war broke out and destroyed all of it. He watched his country transform from, in his words, heaven to hell. The wealth evaporated. The political position vanished. The world his family had built over generations was erased in months by an event that nobody in that world had seriously contemplated. That experience made him what he became, a man obsessed with the gap between what we think we know and what can actually happen. He studied at the University of Paris, earned an MBA from Wharton in 1983, got a PhD from Paris Dauphine, and spent 21 years as a derivatives trader at Credit Suisse First Boston, Banque de Suez, BNP Paribas, and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. He was not an academic who theorized about risk from the safety of a tenured office. He was someone who bet real money every day on the proposition that the models were wrong and the world was more dangerous than anyone admitted. His trading strategy was unusual and often painful. He bought options that were far out of the money, the financial equivalent of insurance policies against events that almost never happen. In calm markets, these positions bled value slowly, day after day, and his fund's returns in normal years were mediocre or negative. Other traders mocked the strategy. It looked like he was throwing money away on lottery tickets, but the strategy was not designed for normal years. It was designed for the day the models broke. On October 19th, 1987, the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 22.6% in a single day. Black Monday. Under a Gaussian model, this was approximately a 25 sigma event. Under a Gaussian model, this was approximately a 25 sigma event. The probability of that happening is a number so small that writing it out requires a 1 followed by 135 zeros in the denominator. It should not happen once in the entire lifespan of 1,000,000 universes. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Taleb had accumulated a large position in deeply out-of-the-money puts on euro-dollar futures, options that were almost worthless under normal conditions. When the crash hit, those positions exploded. He reportedly made $35 to $40 million in a single day. A colleague came to him afterward and said, "Do they not know that 6 sigma events only happen once in a lifetime?" Taleb said no, the market does not know it. He spent the next 20 years building the intellectual framework to explain what he had experienced. His 2007 book, The Black Swan, laid it out in terms that the general public could grasp for the first time. A black swan event has 3 properties. It is an outlier, meaning nothing in the historical record convincingly points to it. It carries extreme impact, and after it happens, we construct explanations that make it look retrospectively predictable. But the concept that matters most for this story, the one that completes the picture of how blindness works, is something Taleb called the ludic fallacy, from the Latin word ludus, meaning game. The ludic fallacy is the error of applying the clean, defined probability models of games to the uncontrolled messiness of the real world. In a casino, the rules are known, the odds are calculable, the sample space is defined. You know every possible outcome of a roulette wheel before you spin it. In real life, you do not know the rules. You do not know all possible outcomes. You do not even know what you do not know. Taleb pointed out that the casino is the only human venture where probabilities are known, Gaussian, and computable. Computable risks, he wrote, are largely absent from real life. They are laboratory contraptions. And the catastrophic mistake of modern risk management is to treat the real world as if it were a casino. To assume that because you can calculate a number called value at risk or a number called default correlation, you have actually measured the danger you face. You have not. You have measured the danger inside your model. And your model is not the world. Your model is a simplified, sanitized, Gaussian approximation of a world that runs on power laws. And in the gap between those two things lives every catastrophe you never see coming. Taleb divided the world into two domains. Mediocriston is where the Gaussian works. Human height, weight, calorie consumption. If you add the tallest person on Earth to a sample of 1,000 people, the average barely moves. Extremistan is where power laws rule. Wealth, book sales, financial returns, earthquake magnitudes, pandemic casualties, war deaths. If you add Bill Gates to a sample of 1,000 people's net worth, he dominates the entire sample. The problem is that almost all social and economic phenomena live in Extremistan, and almost all risk models were built for Mediocriston. He illustrated this with what he called the turkey problem. Consider a turkey that is fed every day. Every feeding confirms the turkey's belief that it is the general rule of life to be fed daily by friendly members of the human race, looking out for its best interests. On the afternoon of the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, something unexpected happens to the turkey. The devastating part of the analogy is not the surprise. It is the trajectory leading up to it. The turkey's confidence increased as the number of friendly feedings grew. It felt increasingly safe, even though the slaughter was more and more imminent. The data confirming safety was at its maximum the day before the catastrophe. That is not just an analogy. That is the mathematical structure of every system running Gaussian risk models. The longer the system runs without a crisis, the more historical data accumulates showing low volatility and manageable risk. The lower the models estimate the probability of extreme events, the more confidence grows, the more leverage increases, the more safety margins are consumed, and the closer the system moves to the point of catastrophic failure. The absence of disaster is the mechanism that produces the next disaster. Perrow saw this in organizations. Taleb formalized it in probability theory. And two legal scholars, Kuran and Sunstein, described the social mechanism that makes it work at scale. In 1999, Kuran and Sunstein published a paper called Availability Cascades and Risk Regulation in the Stanford Law Review. Their central concept is deceptively simple. An availability cascade is a self-reinforcing process of collective belief formation. Someone expresses a perception, others notice it, repeat it, and amplify it. The perception becomes more available in public discourse, which makes it seem more plausible. which causes more people to adopt it, which increases its availability further. The cascade works in both directions. It can inflate perceived risks, but far more dangerously, it can suppress them. When a risk has not materialized recently, it loses availability. Nobody talks about it. Nobody writes about it. The collective perception shifts towards safety. And because human beings judge probability by how easily examples come to mind, a risk that nobody is discussing feels like a risk that does not exist. This is the cognitive mechanism underneath the turkey problem. This is why Brooksley-Born's warnings were not merely rejected, but treated as dangerous. The derivatives market had been growing for years without a crisis. Every year of growth was another feeding. Every year without catastrophe was another data point telling the turkey it was safe. Born was not just saying the turkey might die. She was saying something much worse. She was saying the feedings themselves were the problem, and that was a claim so far outside the availability cascade that it registered not as a warning, but as lunacy. The same mechanism operated before every disaster Perrow analyzed. TMI had not had a serious accident. The nuclear industry had not had a major accident in America. Safety was the dominant narrative. Every year of safe operation was evidence that the system worked, right up until it did not. The very thing that created complacency, the accumulation of uneventful days, is what allowed the conditions for catastrophe to develop unnoticed. This has a name outside of academic risk theory. Diane Vaughan, studying the Challenger shuttle disaster, called it the normalization of deviance, the gradual process by which unacceptable conditions become accepted as normal because they have not yet produced a catastrophe. The O-ring erosion on the space shuttle was first observed after the second mission in November of 1981. By 1985, almost half of shuttle flights had experienced it. Each flight that returned safely despite the erosion made the erosion seem less dangerous. The deviance became normal. On the evening of January 27, 1986, engineer Roger Boisoli presented data linking cold temperatures to O-ring failure and recommended against launching. He had written an internal memo 6 months earlier warning of a catastrophe of the highest order and loss of human life if the O-ring problem was not fixed. NASA pushed back. The burden of proof was reversed. Instead of having to prove it was safe to fly, the engineers were asked to prove it was unsafe. A Thiokol senior vice president turned to his vice president of engineering and said, "Take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat." The vote was changed. Challenger launched the next morning. Boisoli later recounted that night. He went home, opened the door, and did not say a word to his wife. She asked what was wrong. He said, "Oh, nothing, honey. It was a great day. We just had a meeting to go launch tomorrow and kill the astronauts. But outside of that, it was a great day." 73 seconds after liftoff, 7 people died because the system had normalized the evidence of its own fragility. Richard Feynman, investigating the disaster, performed a demonstration during the Rogers Commission hearings that remains one of the most devastating moments in the history of public inquiry. He took a piece of O-ring rubber, compressed it in a clamp, dropped it into a glass of ice water, and showed that it lost all resilience. Decades of engineering analysis reduced to an experiment anyone could understand. But here is a detail that was kept secret for years. The insight that led Feynman to the O-ring was not his own discovery. It was passed to him by astronaut Sally Ride, who was on the commission and had obtained NASA test results showing the O-ring vulnerability. Ride gave the data to General Donald Kutina, who hinted to Feynman where to look. Kutina kept Ride's identity secret until after her death in 2012. Even the act of revealing the truth had to be smuggled through back channels because the institutional pressure to protect NASA's reputation was that strong. Feynman found that NASA officials estimated the probability of shuttle failure at 1 in 100,000. His own analysis put it closer to 1 in 100, a 1,000-fold discrepancy between what the institution believed and what the physics said. His conclusion has never been surpassed for clarity. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. But nature is being fooled. Or rather, we are fooling ourselves about nature. Because here is the thing that nobody wants to say. The shift from the old risk models to the new ones that were supposed to prevent another crisis has been largely cosmetic. Basel III, the international banking regulatory framework adopted after 2008, replaced value at risk with expected shortfall as the primary risk metric. Expected shortfall is better. It measures the average loss in the worst tail scenarios instead of just the threshold. But researchers have shown that in the conditional Gaussian case, there is essentially no difference between 99% VAR and 97.5% expected shortfall. The underlying distribution is still Gaussian. The underlying assumption is still that tails are thin. The fundamental architecture has not changed. Black Scholes, the options pricing formula that assumes stock prices follow geometric Brownian motion with normally distributed returns, and constant volatility remains the foundation of options pricing worldwide. In 1997, Myron Scholes and Robert Merton received the Nobel Prize in Economics for this work. Fisher-Black would have shared it, but had died in 1995. The ceremony in Stockholm was the culmination of 3 decades of mathematical finance. The bell curve had been institutionalized. It was elegant, it was teachable. It generated formulas that could be implemented by anyone with a spreadsheet. And it had just been crowned by the highest honor the profession could bestow. In 1998, 1 year later, long-term capital management collapsed. LTCM was a hedge fund founded in 1993 by John Merriweather, the former head of bond trading at Salomon Brothers, and its partners included Nobel laureates Scholes and Merton themselves. The fund used Black-Scholes-derived models for convergence arbitrage. Initial returns were spectacular, roughly 20% in 1994, around 40% in 95 and 96. At the start of 1998, the fund had equity of about $4.7 billion and had borrowed over $125 billion, leverage of roughly 25 to 1. The total notional value of its derivatives positions reached approximately $1.25 trillion. According to their models, the fund losing all its capital would require what they called a 10 sigma event, one occurrence in every 10 to the 24th power times, more improbable than anything in the observable universe. In August of 98, Russia devalued the ruble and defaulted on its bonds. Credit spreads exploded everywhere simultaneously. The carefully calibrated convergence, trades all diverged at once. LTCM lost 44% of its value in a single month, $2.1 billion gone. By September 2002, equity had collapsed from $4.7 billion to 600 million. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York organized a $3.65 billion emergency bailout involving 14 major banks because LTCM's collapse threatened to bring down its counterparties. Who would bring down their counterparties? Who would bring down the global financial system? The tight coupling again. One fund's failure propagating through the network faster than anyone could respond. Nobel Prize winners' fund collapsed due to exactly the type of event their Nobel Prize winning models said was impossible. 1 year after the prize, and the financial industry's response was revealing. PBS documented it. People said a lot of things they ended up not meaning, like we are never going to get leveraged again like this. Of course, they did. Within a decade, leverage in the financial system was higher than it had been before LTCM collapsed. The turkey went back to eating. The FTSE has experienced 5 events that Gaussian statistics would classify as having a probability of once since the Big Bang. That is 5 events with 6.4 or more standard deviations of magnitude in just 25 years of data. Either the Big Bang happened 5 times or the distribution is not Gaussian. Insurance regulation across Europe still uses value at risk at 99.5% as the primary solvency metric. Pension funds in the United Kingdom used leveraged gilt strategies that were stress tested for a 100 basis point rise in yields. When yields moved several times that amount in September of 2022, 60% of defined benefit pension schemes came under threat. Pension fund assets fell approximately £425 billion, and Legal and General admitted it had never stress tested for such a scenario. A UK parliamentary committee found that 99% of pension trustees had no understanding of the risks embedded in their own portfolios. In July of 2200, a single faulty configuration update to CrowdStrike's Falcon sensor software crashed approximately 8.5 million Windows systems worldwide in 78 minutes. Flights were cancelled, hospitals went offline, emergency services failed, Fortune 500 losses exceeded $5 billion. A monoculture of security software, automatically updated with no staged rollout, connected to kernel-level system processes with no human review. Interactive complexity, tight coupling, a normal accident 40 years after Perrow published the theory. In February of 2021, Winter Storm Uri hit Texas and took 40% of the state's generating capacity offline in 4 hours. The Cascade was pure Perrow. Cold froze gas wellheads and processing facilities. Gas production dropped by half. That cut electricity generation and gas-fired power plants. The power cuts then knocked out the electricity, running more gas facilities. A feedback loop that no one had modeled because the components were managed by separate companies, separate regulators, separate industries that were never supposed to interact. Wind turbines froze. Coal piles froze. A nuclear reactor tripped when a water pump froze. Water treatment plants failed. The grid came within 4 minutes and 37 seconds of total statewide collapse. If it had collapsed completely, engineers estimated it could have taken months to restart. At least 246 people died. Estimated property damage exceeded $195 billion. And here is the fact that elevates this from a weather disaster to a systems failure. A nearly identical cold snap had hit Texas in 2011. A federal report recommended winterization. The recommendations were never mandated. The turkey went back to eating. And the next generation of systems is worse. Artificial intelligence operates with billions of parameters whose interactions are opaque even to the people who built them. AI systems exhibit both of Perrow's fatal conditions. Interactive complexity, because the relationships between parameters produce emergent behaviors that cannot be predicted, including hallucinations that the system presents with total confidence. Tight coupling, because AI systems operate at microsecond timescales in financial trading, in autonomous vehicles, in automated infrastructure, with no slack for human review. Stanford's AI Index documented that AI safety incidents surged from 149 in 2000 to 233 in 2004, a 56% increase in 1 year. Academic researchers have stated explicitly that AI systems fulfill exactly the criteria outlined by Perrow. On average, approximately 14 smaller flash crashes occur in financial markets every single trading day. Automated systems interacting with other automated systems in ways their designers never anticipated, producing cascading failures that resolve in milliseconds but occasionally do not. Each one is a tremor. The earthquake has not happened yet, and the models say it cannot. Charles Perrow died peacefully in his sleep on November 12, 2019, at the age of 94, in a retirement community near New Haven, Connecticut. He received the Distinguished Career Award from the American Sociological Association that same year, the highest honor in his field 40 years after he began the work. His book has been cited more than 12,000 times. He had stopped giving interviews about normal accidents years before his death. He just did not want to talk about it anymore. He had said what he had to say. He had been right, and it had not mattered enough. Mandelbrot died in 2010, having warned for 47 years. His warnings were correct for every single one of those years. Nobody changed the models. Taleb is still alive. He is still warning. Universa Investments, the fund he advises, returned 3,612% in a single month during the COVID crash of March 2020. The strategy is simple. Bet that the world is more dangerous than the models say it is. The strategy keeps working because the models keep being wrong. Here is what you are not supposed to take from this. You are not supposed to take away that the system is fragile and you should be scared. That is the wrong conclusion. The right conclusion is worse. You are supposed to understand that you are inside the system. You are not an observer looking at a nuclear control room from outside. You are Craig Faust staring at an indicator light. The instruments you rely on, the economic forecasts, the risk assessments, the stress tests, the institutional assurances that the banking system is safe, that the grid is resilient, that the AI systems are under control. All of those instruments are built on the same mathematical assumptions that have been proven wrong repeatedly, catastrophically, and at enormous human cost. The light says the valve is closed. The valve is open. And the structure of the system guarantees that you will not see it, not because you are stupid, because the system is designed at the level of mathematics and organization and social psychology and institutional incentive to make the absence of catastrophe indistinguishable from the presence of safety. Every day that passes without a crisis is another data point confirming the models. Every year of stability increases confidence. Every feeding makes the turkey feel safer. Perrow proved in 1984 that the architecture produces the failure. Mandelbrot proved in 1963 that the mathematics hides it. Kuran and Sunstein proved in 1999 that the social dynamics suppress awareness of it. Taleb proved that betting against it is the most profitable trade in the history of finance, and every person who warned was either ignored, mocked, or destroyed. The same math is running every risk model in the world right now. The same tight coupling connects every critical system you depend on. The same availability cascades are telling you that because nothing has collapsed today, nothing will collapse tomorrow. That feeling you have, the one that says the system is basically fine, that the smart people are handling it, that the safeguards are adequate. That feeling is the product of the blindness mechanism. It is not evidence that you are safe. It is evidence that the mechanism is working. The calculations have been done. The proof was published in 1984. And the reason nobody sees the collapse coming is that the mathematics, the organizations, and the architecture of your own cognition are designed independently and convergently to make sure you never do.